Hi, everyone. Please allow me to introduce the director of that amazing film, Maris Curran.
Hello. Thank you for staying.
So I wanted to start this out just by taking a moment to congratulate you on this sort of penultimate day of this incredible journey that you've had. The movie gets released tomorrow, so this is the end of this incredible journey. And I want to see, can you take us back to sort of the moment just before it began? I don't know what you would count as the start of it, but where were you in your life right before it began, now that we're meeting you right before it ends?
The it meaning when the film was finished, or the it meaning when the film began?
When the film began, and you're, creatively, or however you mark that beginning in your mind.
Well, the film is a piece of fiction, but it began from an emotionally true, very specific place. So I began to write the movie as my marriage was falling apart. So it's not autobiographical, but it comes from a similar kind of set of questions that I was facing, that the main character, Sherwin, is facing, which kind of start with what happens when the floor falls out from under you, and what happens when your idea about your sense of self, your future family, change really in an instant. And that was kind of the jumping off place, because both as a writer and then as a director, I think it's very important to kind of begin with an offering, right? Begin with something that's specific, that's emotional, to share with your collaborators. And it is, I've been thinking a lot, particularly this week, about kind of how far I've traveled from there, and my life looks different. I'm happy. You don't make films for catharsis, but it's nice when it's a small byproduct.
How did you know so it came from an emotional truth and an emotional nugget, what kind of flower, how did you know what shape that would take, and what kind of story you would end up telling? I mean, did you know you weren't going to tell necessarily your story, but you were going to use it, or did you think that maybe you were writing something more autobiographical and then it didn't turn out that way?
No, I mean, I think for me, the projects I choose to do are the projects that won't go away. So they're the projects that, I mean, it's a little schizophrenic, but they're the projects that live in my head without me doing anything. And if they've lived there long enough, then that means that's the project that I have to write. And really it was more these characters of Sherwin and Fiona that were in my head. And I let them live there for a while before I start writing.
Just hang out, kind of rent-free, and
they talk to me.
Now, this film takes place in Georgia and in Maine, obviously, and you kind of grew up right in between those two places in Philadelphia. Quaker educated, is that right? Talk about that and how that sort of might have informed your view of the world and of life and of humanity.
Well, I think three things really shaped kind of my core sense of self. Where I grew up in the beginning of North Philly. I grew up in a very kind of kinetic, urban, diverse environment. My mom is an artist, and so I also grew up amongst artists. She's a painter. And then Quaker education. So I grew up with this kind of very humanist base, service base, critical, consensus building sort of world. And I mean, all of those things they're built into the fabric of me, and I think they're a part of the work that I make and my voice.
When did you figure out that your canvas was going to be film?
So I grew up making things because my mom is an artist. So
what sort of things?
I mean, most anything you can make, right? Like painting, drawing. I was very crafty, beading things, weaving things, marbleizing. I mean, building sculptures. I mean, whatever it is. I had in the basement, a door set on horses where I could get as messy as I wanted.
Right.
And reading. I mean, reading is my first love, and I still read voraciously.
Everyone needs to grow up with a door on horses, because you can't do anything wrong on that, right? I mean, it's just a blank space.
And you don't have to clean it up.
No, you don't. You could just take it down if you need to.
But when I went to college, and I grew up loving cinema, but not really, even growing up in a somewhat unusual way, I didn't really have an understanding that was a job or even kind of a route that I could take. And then when I went to Smith undergrad, and when I was there, I had heard that there was this amazing production teacher who was teaching an advanced class, documentary class on representation. And it wasn't going to be offered again, and so I just went to her and I said, I know I don't have the experience, but I'll work really hard. Can I please take your class? And she said, yes. We talked 4 days ago. We're still quite close, and this is many years later, and I've come and taught with her. Like, she'll invite me and I'll teach workshops in her classes now. And it was really one of those few kind of aha moments where it was everything I loved coming together. And then when I showed the film that I made in that class, people cried, and it was like, oh, and there's the potential to move people. But I went on a much more kind of experimental track. So I was making experimental films and videos, and did a graduate program through the Whitney Museum in New York, and then went to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for a master's that has Stan Brakhage founded that program, and it's quite experimental. And it was there I actually realized, oh, I want to be a narrative filmmaker, oddly enough.
It's always when you're surrounded by other people who are making experimental film that you realize, no, I want to tell a story. Now they were films that were telling stories, but not as linear. That's right. Now, I think for me, and I'm guessing for a lot of people here, one of the most moving things about this film was the way that it ruminated on race, and I wanted to talk to you about that. Was that part of the inception of the piece, or did that? What did you want to say, and was that part of the original kind of concept of the story?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is to say is that the main themes of the film are not race, which I think you can get by watching it. I think it's important that we're able to make films that are cast with actors of color where the #1 theme is not race. And that's not denying how important it is to the story and to the subject and to the lives of everybody who's inhabiting and consuming the stories, but it's saying, the way I articulate it is the themes of the film are love and loss. I mean, what's more universal than to love somebody and lose them? And the fabric of the film is race. And
so it's sort of like a canvas, or
more like real life.
Yeah. But it's interesting. I don't know that it's ever sort of directly discussed in the film, but it's there in a very beautiful way, and I sort of wish that more people who are having this conversation right now could see a movie like this.
I mean, I think, one thing that David talks about a lot when, we're sitting all here together is that, it's making films ultimately is about, like, ideally accessing people's humanity, right?
Right.
And this film is really about the emotional life of Sherwin, of an African-American man who's exposed and going through the most difficult time he can personally imagine, and also trying to come out of it. And I think that it's really important that we create media where we can see each other's humanity.
Right. Now, I'm so glad that you brought up David and emotion, because we've just gone through a summer of watching summer movies where guys do amazing thing and blow stuff up, but I've never seen anything like that, where the emotional calisthenics that he does in this film are just remarkable, and his access to his emotion. I imagine you must have been in awe of his ability to tap into such raw feeling. I feel like I hadn't seen anything like it in quite. I can't recall such a raw emotional. Was it strange kind of witnessing that, or how do you talk about his process? Well, just talk about David. He's incredible.
So, the wild thing about making a film like this is how long it took. It took quite a long time to make the film. So David, from saying yes, and he came on as an actor and a producer, to premiering at Toronto was 3.5 years. So we really had quite a collaboration. I think that's really.
Now, you wrote this part for him, is that correct?
I wrote it, and I think there's I knew exactly what I was looking for, which was an actor who has this kind of magnetism that we often associate with a movie star, somebody who draws you in, who you want to watch in every frame of the film, and yet an ability to convey deep emotion and quiet. And those are often not qualities you find in the same actor.
Right.
It takes somebody very special, and I think David possesses that. So, I mean, we shot right after Selma. David was exhausted. We shot in rural Maine, where when you're talking about like how it feels, to be a person of color in Maine, this was something that the actors and our crew members of color were actually facing being in that town. I mean, that is what it looks like. That's actually how it is. And I think that was actually an important part of shooting, because David would come in the morning and he would say, Maris, I didn't get a double take, I got a quadruple take this morning when I was running. And I mean, it's not that I am sadistic and want him to have that experience, but that really was the experience of this character. And so I feel like I'm losing my train of thought with talking about David.
That kind of stuff is especially important in a film like this, because this film dares not to explain, right? I mean, that seems like one of the hardest things to do in script writing and in storytelling, is to not tell everything. And you risked that in this movie. Talk about that. I mean, was there any pressure to explain more, and why, and the importance of not over-explaining, and why you didn't over-explain in this film?
I mean, that's what I'm interested in terms of being a filmmaker. I'm interested in kind of slicing a house open and kind of popping in as a viewer the way you would in, if I were to meet any of you, the way that, I wouldn't know your backstory or necessarily where you're going. I would learn what you tell me in the moment, and only that. And in a sense, that's what these people's relationships and lives are like. And that's kind of like the period of time that we get with them is, you know more about me because I'm standing here blabbing and telling you about where I grew up. But often that's not how real life is. And I think that there's the potential for intensity and deep feeling and empathy. I'm interested in creating empathetic cinema.
Right. Describe that, the idea of empathetic cinema. Is it something that you that you're finding elsewhere, or is it something that feels like, what does it mean to you in that idea of empathetic cinema?
It means that I'm going to sit in the dark and experience somebody else who's outside of me and possibly my experiences, and experience what it would be like to be in their shoes, ideally feel them, and at the best kind of potential be changed by it.
Mm-hmm. So that in many ways, the story that you tell of this relationship, first of all, Dianne's character is so difficult and challenging. I think we were all challenged by her, and you're very and we've all been in a house with a person like that. I'm sure in our lives, and had that look shot over to us for something that we don't know what the hell we did,
But fragile at the same time.
Yeah, but exactly. But as fragile as you can possibly be, and still be alive, right? So that combination, I mean, she's an incredibly decorated actress. She's achieved just about everything, but I don't feel like she's ever done that before. It must have been hard for her.
Oh, absolutely.
Talk about that.
We had a screening. We did a Q&A 2 days ago with David and Dianne and myself, and what David was saying is that kind of the experience of working with her was seeing how much of herself she gave and how much it actually cost her, right? Like this idea of going there so profoundly that you leave part of yourself on the floor. And I mean, I think she really does work that way.
Well, and also she's, to be that fragile and to not ask to be loved or to ask to be sort of taken care of in that moment, to sort of be defiant in your personhood, even in your most fragile moment. I mean, that must be hard to connect there. And how did you come to get Dianne Wiest to be in your movie?
We went the traditional route. We sent it to her reps at ICM, and they read it very quickly and said, "You'll hear from Dianne soon." I met with her 2 weeks later, and it was a really special day. I met with Dianne and Rosie the same day, and they both said yes. And Rosie was actually a slightly different story. I feel like it's a story where it shows the limits of my creativity, because I didn't think of Rosie for that role. And her reps were reading the script for another reason, and then they called and they said, "What about Rosie?" And I said, "Oh, what a smart idea."
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
And I mean, she brings so much warmth and humanity, and like this movie without her might be too much.
Right, that's right. Well, I heard you guys laughing. There's some moments of comedy,
levity.
In this. Yeah, I don't know if levity I go all the way, but it's funny. And there's a little bit. Talk about humor. Did you want to? Did you feel some pressure to sort of soften things or lighten things up? Because it's a, I mean, it's tough from beginning to end. And talk about your own sense of humor.
Well, it was great when we premiered at Toronto. I sat with Rosie and David, and at the end of the movie, David turned to me and he said, "I didn't know our movie was funny." And I said, "No, David, I kept on telling you." And he said, "Yeah, I thought it was funny for an audience of one, you." So it's like very much my idiosyncratic sense of humor, but I'm glad.
How do your friends describe it, your sense of humor?
I haven't asked them that question.
You don't want to know.
They either laugh or don't, I guess.
Now, the look of the film is particularly unique. Sofian Elfani, your Turkish cinematographer who shot...
Tunisian.
Tunisian, pardon me. The blue is the warmest color. I don't know if you guys saw that.
In Timbuktu.
Yeah, that's right. Again, just a master of intimacy. Talk about the look that you wanted to get and kind of what were your template for the feel of the images.
Well, I think in picking Sofian, I was picking something very specific. If you've seen Blue is the Warmest Color, it's like this visceral, sensual, also close, intimate film.
Very close.
And that's what I was going after. And I think, going back to this idea of reading, one thing that the novel does that movies can't always do is really kind of thrust you into the shoes of a character and get you inside of their heads. And I was interested in kind of putting you into that feeling of grief, which I would describe as claustrophobic and nauseating and close. And so we decided to really narrow the frame for that reason, to kind of thrust you into his shoes, and the idea is you're there from the first frame till the last. So and that's also why it's handheld. Mm-hmm.
The feeling of being that close to someone when both of them are giving such vulnerable performances is I would feel like in other hands it would feel invasive almost. It would almost feel like I was somewhere that I shouldn't be.
Voyeuristic.
Yeah, voyeuristic, right? Or I would just kind of look away and I'll give you a moment here, But somehow there's a gentleness to the approach that somehow allowed me to be there at what seemed like a man's most terrifyingly vulnerable moment that he'd ever experienced.
Delicate, it's very delicate.
Yeah, yeah. Now, talk about the atmosphere that you kind of build to maintain that, because that feels like, one bad joke or one bad remark and the steam could go out of, especially when the clock is ticking on an indie movie, you know what I mean? How did you maintain the feeling to be able to keep going to that very raw emotional space? Well,
even though it's my first feature, I have a lot of production experience. I've worked commercially and worked on crews from 2 to 100 and for many years, both directing and producing. I talked to all of the crew members before, met with all of them, and had them all read the script. It's amazing how that really helps in terms of setting the tenor. And talked about,
it doesn't always happen?
No, it doesn't always happen. And talked about what I wanted to achieve with the movie and on set, right? Which is like, we're here to work. It needs to be respectful, but it's also I mean, I'm a firm believer that most of our lives is spent on set, in pre-production, you know, actually in the business of it, not here showing a film. And so, you know, it has to feel like a good environment for all of us. And we shot on that property is 600 acres. There's like no cell phone service or Wi-Fi or anything like that there. And so, and
that's got to help.
Like help and hurt at the same time. But I think everybody knew what we were there to do. But all of these actors are also very, very funny people.
Right.
And so there has to be that levity and coming out and kind of, you know, you don't want to cry all day on set either. But we shot in 19 days, which is crazy fast. And we had like no rehearsal time. So, and I knew that going in. So I really spent a lot of time with the actors ahead of time. You know, every time I could, having dinner or having email conversations, Skyping when necessary, just so that we were doing kind of that work of rehearsal.
So what were the natures of
beforehand.
some of those conversations? Were you running lines, talking about motivation? Were you telling stories? Like what was the nature?
I mean, I think it's like you're not working, but you're working, right? It's like it's very revelatory what you tell each other in those types of moments, and the stories you choose to tell and how you're interacting. I brought Dianne and Rosie actually didn't know each other before this. They respected each other's work tremendously. So we met at MoMA and we went and saw a show, and then we had lunch, and I mean, we had so much fun. We laughed.
Sounds really
and
nice.
it was great. But I mean, I think that actually was this really meaningful moment for all three of us and for the work that we did in the film.
Now, it can't be a lot of fun going about the process of funding a project like this. And I can't imagine it's your favorite thing to do. Am I wrong?
I want to make movies.
So talk about it. I mean, how do you negotiate the funding process without sapping that love and that desire to, you know,
I mean, I don't 100% know because it's my first film, right? So
well, you did it.
I'm learning. Of course, yes. But I'm saying over the long term, I think that's
right.
actually like a sustainability question. We couldn't finance this traditionally. I mean, for the many reasons you can imagine, because I'm a first-time director, because I'm a woman, because it's mostly a cast of color, because the second lead is a woman over 65, because it's about grief. All those things make it hard. Individually, let alone all together. And so there was a lot of, oh, the script's great. I'm going to pat you on the shoulder and I'll buy a ticket tomorrow. Hopefully they'll buy a ticket tomorrow.
Yeah, I know. You're going to call them all back and make sure that they...
So, I mean, what I found is you have to find champions. I mean, I think that's the only way to do this. And I did that through several ways. It was a very hybrid model. We kickstarted in development very early before we were cast, which gave us enough kind of seed money to start. I was very fortunate to get grants from a huge number of film and arts organizations, from the San Francisco Film Society, from Tribeca, from IFP and Film Independent. From Panavision gave me our camera package, and then finding equity investors who believed in the film, who believed in the collaborators, and who believed in me. And really then it becomes, in a sense, a family affair, because the same way that the actors are invested, the investors are quite literally there with you, believing in what you're doing.
What has been a sort of moving moment that you've had now that this process has concluded with one of those early backers or people that believed in you?
I mean, I think you have, I mean, I'm going to answer it slightly differently. I was, this week has been all about kind of getting ready for the release, and we did a screening in New York on Monday and then here on Tuesday, and I was with David and Rosie on Monday, and we were about to go up and do this, and she squeezed me and said, you know, I'm so excited to see what is going to happen for you in your career, right? And kind of squeezed me. And I turned to her and I said, you know, I've never said this to you, Rosie, but the very first time we met, you basically told me something very similar, how you were really excited to see what, you know, I'm going to go on to do. And, you know, she said it very heartfelt. And there were times in that process, which, you know, now is over 2 years ago, where
Right.
it's felt impossible, where I go back and rewind to that moment and say, okay, we're going to let today go and tomorrow is going to be a new day, because it is that hard sometimes.
Well, it's amazing how you can feel that squeezing of your hand, you know, when you need it. It's like we got to remember to squeeze each other's hands now and again, because we recall on it when we need to.
And support each other's work. I mean, I think,
Yeah.
you know, I'm luckily a part of a, you know, young group of filmmakers that, you know, not necessarily formally, where, you know, we're all trying to do different things, but we need each other, you know, and that's whether it's, you know, somebody crying on the phone one night, or whether it's reading scripts or recommending actors, and I mean, whatever it is.
Now, as hard as it is to get your first film funded and off the ground, the sort of the scary thing that nobody ever talks about is that the second one is harder. It can be like that can be. I'm sorry. I mean.
My movie opens tomorrow. Come on.
So what I'm trying to say is, what's next, and how do you and how is the approach different the second time than it is the first?
Well, I've written my next film, and I already have some financing for it. So I think that was the hardest hurdle for this film. So I have First In, which feels good. And I also just finished a short documentary, which I didn't anticipate making, but was a lot of fun and very freeing. And we cut the credits off and the song that was playing with them, but the song was by this artist and musician named Lonnie Holly, who is quite remarkable. You should look him up. And in having him make this piece of music, we became close, and I made this short little film about his source of inspiration. And he's pretty wild and fabulous.
Now, one thing you don't have going for you this time is that you're not in a, you know, desperate place of sadness. You know, which
I think that's okay.
that's not so bad, is what you're saying. Well, good. That's a good thing. Now, I want to ask you about water a little bit in the movie, and specifically, I think the scene that kind of took my breath away, and I think probably did for you guys too, in the lake, when David goes under and you hold that long scene, and we're all thinking, is he Virginia Woolfing here? Like, what's exactly going on here, right?
A new verb.
You guys thought that, didn't you? Okay, thank you. But talk about that day and that scene, and just set that for us, because as soon as I saw that, I was like, man, I want to know how that happened.
Oh, I wish David was here, because, I mean, it was like, even just on paper, he didn't want to do it, let alone in the lake, because I have to say, it wasn't the nicest lake to go into. But I think it was important, and, you know.
You mean you didn't have a crew come in and clean out the lake before he dunked him?
I think we cleaned it a little bit, but not enough. But I think we knew it was emotionally very important. I mean, if David could have said, can we not do this? He would have, but he knew. Yeah, I mean, there's water throughout the film.
But holding it for that long, it was just, what was the inception behind that? And I guess, I don't know what kind of emotional catharsis I had, but it took my breath away. So what was sort of the concept of having him do that, I guess, in that moment?
Well, I mean, I think you're hitting on it, right?
Well, I guess I am. I guess I did exactly what you were shooting for, right? And I wanted to ask you as well about the music in the film, and kind of what your concept was for it, and how it came together.
David Bolter from the Tindersticks did the score.
Oh yeah.
And I actually have never met David, which is remarkable. He lives in Prague, and we did this all over Skype and email. But I think he emotionally got the film, and it's this kind of mix almost between, I mean, we had sound designer, and our sound designer was amazing, but sometimes it's quite ambient, and sometimes it feels more like score, but it feels kind of a part of this world. And you can imagine a version of this film that has like a very kind of classical, over the top score that tells you what to think when, which
Right.
I did not want. I wanted to resist that.
So what I alluded to in the top of the conversation, the idea that this is the end of the journey, do you feel like you've put down a gigantic boulder and that you have accomplished something, or that you've cut? I mean, do you feel that, or not so much?
I mean, I think it's more porous than that, just because, I mean, I don't know when this really ends, and I think the thing that will stick with me for a really long time is bringing the film to audiences and having conversations and hearing from people and really feeling like this film gives people permission to talk about things that are important to them, either with me or not, amongst each other. And that's really why I made it. And so I think that's what sticks with me. And more than anything, I'm ready to make the next one.
Mm-hmm. Have you had a lot of people come up to you and talk to you a little bit about grief? Because it is such a hard thing to talk about, and it does kind of give a little bit of permission. Especially, there's something very cathartic. I don't know if you guys felt it too, of just like not having a lot of sympathy for the person who is dying, you know, because that's a hard thing to articulate or feel, and there was something cathartic about seeing it here. Can you talk a little bit about that? People talking to you about grief?
Yeah, and I think also the fact that two people are grieving very differently.
Yeah, right.
Which means like there's not one way to grieve, right? And they're, I mean, you don't want to judge them and say they're doing it badly, but they're doing it in a very messy way, both of them. Yeah, I mean, I think it's been amazing. People have shared their stories. People have cried in Q&As. People have sent me emails afterwards. I mean, people have come up and said, I'm not going to tell you my story right now, but I want you to know I was able to tell this person that I'm here with, and I never had, right? And I think that, I mean, when I think about the film kind of in a high-level way, not in a story-specific way, I kind of have this analogy where grief, I think of as an emotion that happens behind closed doors.
That's right.
That it's meant to, and it's meant to be an individual experience. And the film is really about opening that door. And instead of kind of looking down and in yourself, you actually are looking out and seeing somebody else's pain. Mm-hmm. And like, what is the potential for transformation in that moment if instead of looking down and seeing yourself, you look out and you see somebody else. And I think that's powerful.
And there's something to be said for just like experiencing it and not helping someone or like, you know, getting them through it, or, you know, everything that sort of that mode we click in when we're in that. We're like, oh, I'm gonna, you know, I'll cheer you up, or, you know, but just to see it and to be there and witness it and soak it in, I guess. Empathetic filmmaking, I suppose. All right, now I figured it out. Okay. Well, I sort of feel like we all kind of feel like Rosie Perez tonight, in that we're very lucky to have met you and seen you at the beginning of what's going to be a very exciting and fabulous career. So
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you guys for being here today. Thank you.
Please tell your friends to come see the film.
Yeah, please.
It's at the Laemmle Music House in Beverly Hills, starting tomorrow.